Hello and welcome back to the course on AI. In the previous part, we talked about the deep learning, Q-learning intuition. We started there, and in fact, we actually got all the way to this part and where we talked about learning. And now we're going to move on to the actual acting part. So there's two parts, two distinct parts that we have to remember. So that's the learning part, but now he's done all of this. That's beautiful. Now he actually has to take an action. He has to decide what is he going to do. He's going to do action 1, 2, 3, or 4. And so how does he do that? Well, the way he does it is now, given those same Q values, so the Q values don't change. After we have these Q values, we've compared them, we've calculated the loss, we've backpropagated the error, we've updated the weights, but the Q values don't change in that whole process. So after we've got the Q values, they're fixed. We know what they are, so all of this happens, the network's updated, and now using those same Q values that we had, what we're going to do is we're going to pass them through a softmax function. And again, softmax is described in Annex 2, and we'll talk a bit more about softmax further down or we'll talk about this action selection policy further down in the rest of this section, so just in a few tutorials. But for now, we're just going to say we're passing it through a softmax function, and basically what it does is it helps select the best one. It selects the best action possible. And there's a small caveat to that. It's not just the best one possible. We'll talk about that in the action selection policy tutorial. But for now, let's just say it selects the best action from here. It says, okay, so Q1, the likelihood, basically we know the Q values. So it's predicted the Q values, so it can look at them and say, okay, so the highest Q value out of these, just as we did in the simple Q-learning algorithm, it'll just look at all these four, say the highest Q value is this one, and I'm going to select that action. I'm not going to take those. And that's pretty much it. That's how it chooses which action to take, takes the action, and then all of this process happens again for the next state the agent ends up in our case, in the next square of the maze. But generally speaking, it's the next state. So there we go. That's how we feed in a reinforcement learning problem into a neural network through a vector describing the state that we're in. And once we feed it in, there's two parts of the process that happen. Part one is the learning. So remember that part where we compare each of the Q values with the targets, and then we backpropagate the loss through the network to update the weights so that our network is learning as we go through this maze or through this environment. And also the second part is, of course, we have to act. We have to select an action. And that is where we pass the Q values through the softmax function or basically an action selection policy, which we'll talk about further down. And then we simply select the action that we want to take and we perform that action. And then this whole process starts again. And then maybe the agent gets to the end. Maybe the agent doesn't pass the game. In any case, the game ends. And then once again, the whole process repeats. The agent plays the whole game again, and then that stops. So basically, that's another epoch. Every time the agent, every time the game ends, whether favorably or unfavorably, that's the end of an epoch, and then he starts again, and then he starts again, and then he starts again, and so on. So that happens, and this process happens for every single time the agent is in a new state. So the state is encoded here. So that's important. So not just for every single game that he plays, but for every single state. So he's in a state, it goes through this process, updates, and so on, and happens every single time. And so the learning happens, and then the acting happens as well. So that is deep Q learning or the intuition behind deep Q learning. We've got lots more to cover off. And then, of course, we've got the practical. And in the meantime, if you'd like to get some additional information on deep Q learning, we've got a recommended reading. So we've already spoken about Arthur Giuliani's series of blog posts. If you look at Simple Reinforcement Learning with TensorFlow Part 4, you will find the part that's relevant to what we discussed today. Note that here he talks about convolutions. We are not covering convolutions in this section. We're going to be talking about them in the next section of the course. So the difference here is that, so just kind of skip the convolutions part for now, and we'll talk about them in the next part of the course. But the difference is in convolutions, you're like your agent is looking at the image, and therefore he has to process an image, so an additional complication. For now, we're slowly, gradually building up to that. For now, we're encoding our environment through, so if you look here, we're encoding our environment, or maybe look at this one probably, encoding our environment or encoding a state the agent is in as a vector. So in our case, it was a very simple vector of 2 values. Sometimes people, even in that simple maze, sometimes, or as you'll see from this blog post, sometimes people prefer the one hot encoded version of that state. So basically where every single box of the maze has so you have like a vector of, in our case, it would be 12 values, 3 by 4. So it's like either 1 or a 0, depending on which element, in which box you're in the environment. So in whichever way you decide to encode your environment and the state of your environment, that's how we're encoding it. So it's basically a vector. The key here is that it's not a convolution. So it's not like an image and there's no convolution involved. So this part will come later. For us, it starts over here. And that just simplifies the process for us to gradually understand better. And of course, don't forget that this blog post is written in TensorFlow and we're using PyTorch in our tutorials. So hopefully you enjoyed this quick intro into deep convolutional deep Q-learning. And on that note, I look forward to seeing you next time. And until then, enjoy artificial intelligence.